Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with New Role, the business-oriented podcast that brings the boardroom to your channel of choice. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of New Role, the board-level hiring platform that specializes in the high-value chair, independent director, advisory board member, and trustee placements that drive high-impact boards. Today, I'm thrilled to be talking to someone who's been a great friend to New Role from the very beginning, David Sole OBE. David is a former international rugby star with 44 caps for Scotland, including a record 25 as captain, with many highlights, including a Grand Slam win at Murrayfield against England in 1990, widely considered to be one of Scotland's greatest matches, and as a British Lion on the victorious Australia Tour of 1989. David has gone on to excel as an executive, entrepreneur, and board member. He's the current chair of Worldwide Cancer Research and has served in the past the chair of AM Bid Services as a non-executive for Quality Meat Scotland, the Kilcummin Distillery Company, and the Board of Sports Scotland, a Scottish government appointment, where he served on the Audit Committee and was chair of the Remuneration Committee. David is also the co-founder and managing director of School for CEOs, an executive coaching organization that supports those stepping into the demanding role of CEO. Having been a participant myself, I cannot speak too highly of it. David is also an author. His book, 21st Century Networking, details the importance of relationship building to navigating the professional world. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, as always, Ollie. Great to see you again.
David, I'd like to start with your journey into the boardroom, and I'm keen to understand what were the golden threads that got you there?
Gosh, that's a really tough question, and I think it's quite hard to sort of disaggregate it because there's been lots of different stepping stones on the way, and I think I was very fortunate playing rugby in the amateur era to have an incredibly supportive employer when I joined United Distillers, the spirits company of Guinness. Because they were very conscious of my status in, it sounds very grand that, but as an international rugby player in the amateur era, the kind of profile that happened with as being captain as well. So they were conscious of that, and they wanted to leverage that to the benefit of the organisation. But in the same context, they didn't want me to stand up and hold a bottle of Gordon's or a bottle of Bell's or a bottle of Johnny Walker and say, drink these brands because they're great. And so what happened was that I tended to get invited by the senior leadership of the organisation to their major events in Scotland. So Lord Macfarlane, who was then chairman of United Distillers in Scotland, who was an incredible businessman and one of the most gracious and humble people, but with an incredible profile. I got to know him quite well because he would invite me to events or to lunches, and I'd go and meet some senior people in Scotland who were associated with United Distillers and Guinness. And that gave me a sense of kind of what it was like. And part of the threads around my networking book was the opportunity to network with these sorts of people. I used to get invited to go to the Bell Scottish Open, which they sponsored at Gleneagles. And not because I was a great golfer, I was a very average golfer, but it was because it was an opportunity to meet some of their senior customers. And so I met Lord Maclaurin, sat next to Lord Maclaurin, who was on the board of Guinness and at the time, I think probably chairman of Tesco, massively well-known person. I met Brian Baldock, who was chairman of Guinness. So I was mixing with a lot of these people and getting to understand some of the traits and attributes and challenges that they were facing from a board perspective. And, I was a humble grain buyer at the time in Distillers, but, I was sort of operating at the board level in some respects, but still doing my day job in others. And so that was really the kind of the start of it. Progressed through United Distillers, I progressed into more senior roles. And then when Guinness and Grand Met came together, I remember having to write a paper for the board at Guinness to enable us to trade futures because it was the only opportunity that we could actually hedge the price. So putting a paper up to the board was quite interesting. I didn't have to present it, but I had to brief the CEO at Distillers to put the paper up, and it got approved. So I couldn't have done too bad a job. And then Guinness and Grandmet merged to form Diageo. I was involved in writing papers to the Federal Trade Commission and the European Commission to ensure that the merger went through and stuff like that. So that, again, built some exposure, albeit slightly distanced from the board. And then I joined Diageo to do an international role for them. And I remember my boss at the time organised a dinner with Paul Walsh because he wanted to get his team exposed to the CEO of this massive business. And curiously enough, I remember feeling quite intimidated and quite apprehensive about it, because why would the CEO of Diageo want to talk to some buyers? What's that all about? But it was really interesting. Again, tremendous CEO, very successful, very sort of down-to-earth individual, fan of Manchester United, and talked about things outside, and you sort of get that sense that actually there is a human being behind this persona. And from Diageo, I went and joined Whitehead Mann, who at the time had pretty good relationships in the boardrooms of many organisations. I joined as an executive coach rather than as a search consultant. But again, that sort of elevated some of the relationships that I was working in. And so, I was working with CEOs or meeting CEOs or HR directors and that was, quite a significant step. Although I'd had the relationships with many non-execs and chairs on the way up, but not, direct working relationships, I suddenly found myself in talking to a HRD or CEO who was clearly, running a FTSE business and talking to them about the development of some of the direct reports. And so there was a big jump. And that was interesting for me, having had that experience with Paul Walsh and feeling quite intimidated by it, to suddenly step into that relationship and feel much more comfortable and confident in my own ability around what I was talking about and how we could help develop some of their talent in the organisation. And I guess over time, I must have done a reasonable job for them because, my practice developed and I got to be invited to work with more CEOs or board members. And I always had some, desire to sort of be giving back. And so right the way through my time at Distillers, I was always involved in either not-for-profits. I was involved in the Prince's Trust for a long time in Scotland. I ended up chairing committees for the Prince's Trust, Action in Scotland, the chair of the chairs committees and various other things. So I had a kind of sideline in the third sector of running boards or being involved in not-for-profit boards, which again helped massively in terms of understanding some of the dynamics, because I think the dynamics are the same, whether you're a 5 or 10 million pound charity or a commercial organisation. It's all about relationships and getting the best out of those exec, non-exec relationships. And then, I was invited to join the board of Sport Scotland. I did Kilherman, as you said, and various other things. So I've kind of seen it from both sides. So I feel very privileged to have had that unique position of, serving on a board as well as, working with boards to develop some of the execs.
Oh, what an amazing journey. I want to pick up on something there that you talked about, the persona of the CEO. You've obviously coached an amazing array of CEOs from big and sort of a wide spectrum of organizations. But I think it's something that boards often forget about the CEO as a person. I'm curious to hear what is your experience coaching CEOs and also maybe as a chair taught you about how boards can better support the executive and in particular the CEO?
Yeah, well, it is a truism that it is a very lonely place as a CEO because you find yourself elevated into this position either as an internal candidate or as an external candidate, and you have no peer group. You've got no one necessarily to talk to per se, and so it is a very lonely position. You're accountable to the board and you have a relationship with your chair, which is clearly really important. And you've got relationships with your team, which are clearly very important, and perhaps stronger relationships, perhaps with the CFO, given that they should be your partner in crime, not literally, but metaphorically. And, clearly HR director has a really important role to play, or people director, the kind of description varies from organisation to organisation. But I think that the more enlightened boards recognise that. I had one situation where I was invited to meet a CEO with a view to coaching, along with 2 or 3 other coaches, do a sort of beauty parade chemistry meeting. And I said to the CEO, why do you think you need a coach? And he said, well, my chairman said it would be a good idea. And I said, oh, yeah. And he said, yeah, no, the chairman said, clearly you and I, CEO to chair, need to build a really strong relationship. But you have to remember, I'm here to represent the interests of the shareholders and to run the board. You're here to run the company. And there will be times that you will need someone to talk to, because I won't be the right person, because I will have a vested interest or some skin in the game, which may cloud or bias, give me some cause for bias in terms of my views. And therefore, that's why I think you need to have a coach. And I thought it was a really enlightened perspective of the chairman to recognise that actually here was someone, and he was an internal candidate, he'd been the CFO, progressing into the CEO role, that actually he needs some individual support as well. And actually we ended up hitting it off. He chose me as his coach, and we worked together for 12 to 18 months, something like that, as he made that transition and progressed onto the organisation. So I think that realisation of the kind of solitude in that role and the need to have a third party is really important. But I would say it's all about relationships. It's all about developing the right sort of relationships between CEO, chair, non-exec directors, and socializing. Because I was invited to work with another CEO where the relationship with the board was, I'm going to say, antagonistic and quite fractious. And the CEO was a bit of a nuisance, if I'm honest. And so rather resented the fact that, he was paying his non-execs, quite a lot of money in their fees, and they were turning up and not really adding value. And so I said, well, why don't I interview some of the non-execs? So I did that. I went and interviewed them all. And I got a sense of, actually, they felt they could add a lot more value in certain areas than they were being allowed. And I presented back a number of recommendations that the non-execs had come up with in a report. And CEO was an interesting character because he was a sort of person that everything had to be his idea, and he had to allow the idea to gestate and then give birth to it himself. And so I presented the report, and he said, yeah, no, I recognise all this, that's fine. And curiously enough, 3 months later, he said, I think we need to change out our CFO, which was one of the things that the non-execs had mentioned. He said, I think the organisation has outgrown him, and so that's fine. I think I'm going to arrange a strategy day with the board to really talk about strategy, which was another thing that the non-execs had mentioned. And so it was interesting. And ironically, as a consequence of doing this little exercise, that they came much closer together. And, after 6 months or so, he said, I'm getting far more value from my board than I ever thought. I ever thought I could, actually. And the chap in Asia is doing some terrific, work in helping us expand into certain markets. And so, it was all about the relationships between the non-execs and the execs, and investing in those relationships and making sure that you've got a kind of human-to-human relationship and you understand where people are coming from, rather than it just being about governance and the hard stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the questions I often ask other CEOs is your time in the boardroom the highest return on your time invested in your quarter, month, however it often is you meet? And it's amazing how few the answer is yes for that question. What do you see as the reasons CEOs most commonly come unstuck with their boards, and is there anything boards can do to avoid those?
Yeah, I think it is a lack of investment in time of understanding both sets of expectations. So what does the board expect of the CEO, particularly the chair? What does the chair expect of the CEO? And vice versa. What does the CEO expect of their board? And where you've got alignment and you've got people who have invested the time to understand what a non-exec can bring to a board, because you I think most non-execs come wanting to give something back. It's not the traditional, 20 years ago of old school Thai brigade turning up and lots of lunches for the mates. They want to add value to the organisation because they have been appointed to, because they have a skill set they can bring to it. And so part of the responsibility, I think, is for the executives, and not just the CEO, but other members of their executive team, to explore with each of the board members, where those skills lie, what they can give, what they have to offer, and how they can add value to what the organization is trying to achieve. So that requires, I think, an investment in time and the one-on-one relationships. And certainly in the boards that I've been fortunate enough to chair, I really encourage a lot of the work to be done outside of the boardroom, and for execs and non-execs or trustees and senior leaders to build relationships outside of that, so that they are getting those insights, getting that investment, getting the value from the board members that perhaps you don't get if you're just sitting in a room having reviewed a set of board papers. And I really encourage the informal socialization, the relationship building to take place outside of the boardroom rather than in the boardroom.
Yeah, that resonates a lot. One of the things I've found has been really helpful for our own internal advisory board is increasing the number of touch points that they have with the team. So, I now have an advisory board member lined up for each of our functional heads who are effectively acting as mentors and coaches. We invite them along we have an extended leadership team session on a monthly basis, in addition to the senior leadership team, looking to sort of build that muscle across the organization. And we invite them along to those primarily to get them to share their insights, but also actually it gives them a better sense of the organization and identify other areas that they can help. And then actually one thing I liked recently from a CEO I was talking to that they do is they send an email round every month to their board members, just listing all the things that each of the board members has contributed to, where they've added value that month, and creating a sort of semi-competitive dynamic, I think, of everyone thinking, gosh, that email's coming, I better add some value, which I quite liked. I've yet to test it, but so very, very much tempted to. You talked about sometimes when CEOs get it wrong. How should people be thinking about when to change the CEO? Again, you've had a really interesting perspective on this as a coach, seeing it from the other side as well as a chair. It's obviously one of the key responsibilities for board members. It's like a football team. One of the few levers you've got to pull to affect change is changing the CEO. And I've certainly experienced it as a board member where, when you got the wrong CEO, it's like trying to push a ball up a hill with a piece of string. But what has your experience taught you on that?
Don't wait too long to do it would be the kind of key thing.
So everyone always says that, and it was a maxim as a private equity investors. We always used to say, as soon as you think it, change it. Why do people still take too long? When we all know that, or all say that.
I think because it's, we're dealing with human beings here. We're dealing with people's lives and livelihoods there. And there is kind of a real challenge to step into those conversations, step into those issues. I think there's also the point you want to get the right data points to support your kind of gut instinct. So that feeling, I think that you talked about, and we all have had them, I'm sure. It needs to be supported with data points. And sometimes, I think what you find is the most enlightened CEOs know when it's their time to move on. I worked with a CEO of a large FTSE 100 company who had agreed with his chair a transition period, and I was actually working with him to think about what next for him and how does he prepare himself. And he said, it's 18 months, 2 years before I'm going to step down from this organisation. I've agreed that with the chair. And I know that is probably going to be around the right time, because it enables me to manage my own succession, or for the board to manage my own succession. It enables someone to come in. If it's an external person, I'm happy to leave a little bit earlier to ensure there's a smooth transition, and so on and so forth. So, and they said, I recognize that, I've done enough time here. I think he'd served 8 years, which is probably double the average of a FTSE CEO at that particular point. And I say, I recognize that's enough, and it's time for them. So having that self-awareness is really important. I think there's also something in managing the kind of the governance aspect of it as well. So I remember working with someone else, having dinner with them, and they were saying, look, I know that I will either have to leave this organization now, or I'm going to have to stay for probably another 3 years. And I said, oh, really? Why is that? He said, well, I know that my chairman's position is up for renewal in whatever it is, 18 months plus or whatever, but in between that session. So, I either need him to be able to select my successor, or I need to help manage the transition of chair, and then, leave them to successor. And so having that kind of vision, foresight, and self-awareness, I think, is really important. And I think you know from an organizational context as well, if you're a turnaround CEO and you've come in and you've turned the business around and it's performing well and it's now into sort of maturity or growth or sort of steady as you go type thing, most turnaround CEOs know that that's not going to work for them. And so they will know that it's time for them to step away. So I think the key piece, Ollie, is around self-awareness. So knowing yourself as a CEO, knowing what is your sweet spot, what you're going to be best at, and being confident enough to talk to your chairman about that, and be really clear about what your own ambitions are, rather than hiding it under the desk and not being open about it.
And there may be a selection bias there at work, in that you by sort of definition almost work with the enlightened, aware CEOs. Do you have experience of the less happy path, where you can see a CEO kind of burning up in front of you as a coach that hasn't yet realized that actually it's time for them to change, ends up being changed, but you as the coach saw that coming down the road? Are there patterns there that you've spotted?
I've worked with a number of people who have found themselves being on the challenging conversation, and normally most of them haven't seen it coming. They haven't been I don't think I've worked with a CEO in that situation. They've been sort of senior leaders or exec team members. And yes, as I say, they haven't seen it coming. Sometimes it's been as a consequence of a reorganization within the business. So they've been a kind of victim of that reorganization.
And is that a good thing as a board? Do you think, I mean, in some ways I can see the benefits of a senior exec not seeing it coming, because you're in their corner until the minute you're not, and then you make it very swift. And if they see it coming, there's a chance that they're going to disengage. How do you think about that as a coach and chair?
I mean, in this particular instance, the person who saw it coming, he was very shaken up, given sort of 13 or 14 years of his career and life to this organization. And, I said to him, you're going to need time to come to terms with that and grieve, because he'd been really, really committed to it and had progressed really well in the organization. And, being a bloke, he was pretty blasé about saying, I'll be fine, don't worry about it. I said, well, just prepare yourself, because you need to go through that change curve. You need to grieve. And so I remember him phoning me up. He said, you're absolutely right. So there was a moment I almost sort of burst into tears, because I was so distraught, and angry and bitter that how could the organization treat me like this? I've given them 13 or 14 years of my life, and they dismiss me literally out of hand without so much. And he's reasonably well looked after, but he felt very resentful, very angry. And I said, look, the last thing you want to do is start thinking about going to interview when you've got this monkey on your back, and so you need to prepare for that and wait until you've gone through that stage so that you can rationalize your story, you can be really positive about it, and sell yourself to the next organization. And to his credit, he did that. He wasn't in too much of a hurry, because I think that is one mistake that people make. They want to get back on the horse really quickly, and people can see that they're carrying baggage with them. It becomes very, very obvious. And so he gave himself a bit of a gap. We kind of worked together to sort of rationalize how he was going to present himself. He did absolutely brilliantly, and his career has flown since then. And he's doing some wonderful things out on the west coast of Ireland, actually. Interestingly, in his own business. So we went to a couple of corporate organizations, and now he's running his own shop, which he's delighted with.
You talked a little bit about using data earlier in these decisions, and a board needing sort of data to back up their convictions that it is the right time to change a CEO. I suppose there's sort of basic company performance or lagging metrics, but what are the sort of data points you're looking out for? And is there anything, again, as a sort of your experience as a coach has taught you, that people might overlook that are relevant data points?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think engagement surveys are always interesting, because I think piece around visibility of the leadership in the organization. If your organization is saying, well, leadership isn't visible, then you think, hang on a minute, there's a bit of a challenge here. I was working with one organization at the start of the year, and that was a piece of feedback. They just made a transition in CEO designate was starting in January. I did a piece of work with him and his executive team, and they said, actually, we need to be more visible in the organization, because we need to communicate where we're going as an organization right the way through the organization. It was one of the pieces of data that we picked up on our research when we did our first bit of research back in 2013. And we said, our CEOs, as well prepared as they can be as they transition to the top role. And 93% of the people that we surveyed, the CEOs and chairs, said no. And they said that one of the big issues was, how do you communicate not only to your immediate team, but right the way throughout the organization? And there was an interesting piece of data that said, 75% of employees want what the vision means for them, but the leadership team only spend 3% of their time doing that. And so there's, when you've got that disconnect, and you want to create an engaged workforce, and you want them to feel empowered and connected and excited by the story that you're creating, you've got to be able to communicate. So where you've got that gap, and you've got perhaps the senior leadership or the CEO in a kind of glass bubble, perhaps separated from the organization, you're seeing that in an engagement survey, that might sort of start to ring some alarm bells or prompt some red flags to be raised. So I think these data points are really interesting to look at.
Super interesting. I'd love to expand more on that. You've had amazing success as a leader. I'd love to understand more about how you think about setting vision and strategy in the board and ensuring that it does cascade through the organization, so that it's bought in not just from the top down, but also from the bottom up. And it's one I've wrestled with a lot, both as a sort of CEO and board member. It's relatively easy to come up with that sort of top down strategy. It's how do you get it to permeate the entire organization and for people to live and breathe it with the same passion that the leadership team do.
Yeah. It is, you said it, it's about living and breathing it. And the role modeling that you do as a leader is absolutely critical on that. And I think everyone talks about communication, and I don't think I've ever come across an engagement survey that says we're communicating too much in this organization. When that happens, there's always a gap. And I think organizations think that town halls or emails or newsletters, whatever it is, that they'll do one and that's it. Communication's done. Tick that box. Move on to the next task. And I think you always have to appreciate that in any audience, when you're presenting, a third of your audience might get it, understand it, buy into it, and go with you. A third of your audience might hear the words, but they might not understand what that means for them. And so they might leave that session, wondering a little bit about actually what was all that about. And a third of the audience will be wondering what's for lunch. So you've got to be relentless in your communication. And I remember Justin King, I think when he was at Sainsbury's, he used to insist that all of his senior leadership team went out to stores on a Friday. So they would leave the office in Holborn and they'd go to their stores, and they would go in and they would talk to the people collecting the trolleys in the car park, and they'd talk to the people on the tills serving the customers, and they'd talk to the people stacking the shelves, and they'd talk to the managers who were running the stores, and they'd talk to the people unloading the lorries at the back, and all of this sort of stuff. And then they would talk about what they discovered at their store visit on their Monday morning huddle to see what have they learned. But it was the opportunity to do that two-way communication piece, so that Justin King was talking to the guy collecting the trolleys in the car park. He said, it's really important that if it's customer service, if that was his big thing, then we'd talk about customer service and how it was that he was helping the customers access to the trolleys. So contextualize the job in the context of the vision and what was important to them, so that everybody began to sort of understand their role in the kind of the whole of the food chain and of the organization, and how important it was and what impact it was having. And I think that point about communicating in simple layman's terms to everybody is so critical.
Practically, how do you do that? Because one of the things I often sort of worry about is, that third who get it are probably your high performers. The third who think they sort of got it were probably your kind of, your middle of the road. And the third who are wondering what's for lunch are probably the ones that you need to be sort of weeding out over time and upgrading. And if you just keep repeating the same message, you end up, boring your sort of top third. You maybe get the message through to your middle third, and the bottom third are probably still wondering what's for lunch. So what practically do you do to overcome that, other than just repeating as a board?
Yeah, and as I think it's really important not to make it the same set piece. I think when you start hearing that from people on the shop floor, or your bottom third, who, as they're having their lunch, are saying, actually, that point that you made about customer service was that really resonated for me, and actually I can see how I connect with that. So you've got to flex and adapt your messaging according to the audience. So don't tell your high performers the same thing over and over again, because you're absolutely right, they will get bored. But actually, for the people who are eating their lunch, tell them over and over again, and try and manage that communication in a different way, so that you can tell the story in a slightly different way. And I think that narrative, that storytelling, becomes a really important tool for you. So the contextualization piece is so critical, and it happens all around. When someone, the kind of more lowly members of the organization can hold you to account if you're not doing what you say you want to do. That's great. There's a great story. CEO of Wood Group, Bob Keeler, really strong emphasis on health and safety. Work out, a lot of the time they're offshore in the North Sea. Health and safety is really important. And I remember him telling a story of being out on a rig, standing on a balcony, phone call with his mobile phone, and some roughneck on the drilling deck turned up to him and sort of whistled up to him, but looked and shook his finger like that, and said, pointed to get turned around, went like that. And Bob, was on the phone, and he turned around, and there was this sign, with the telephone with the red line through it, which says, obviously saying, no calls on the balcony. And he was both really irritated and delighted in exactly this, in the same moment. He was really irritated because he'd ignored it. He'd ignored, kind of one of the things that was so important to him. But he was absolutely delighted that this roughneck on the drilling platform could hold the CEO to account for something which was so important about health and safety. And so I think, that point about when you can get anyone in the organization holding the CEO to account for something that the CEO says is important and is not displaying the right role modeling behaviors, then you reckon you've got it.
I love that. Brings me on, actually, interestingly, to kind of high performance in the boardroom, because it strikes me that many boards hold their executives to account on high performance and yet don't hold themselves to the same standard of account. You introduced me to the sort of support challenge framework as a way to sort of think about this, but how do you go about as a chair getting the best out of your board members individually?
It's a good question. I think it starts with the recruitment of the board members, which is why organizations like yours play such a critical role in getting a board together. And on the one hand, I'm going to say you need the kind of chemistry on the board to connect and for the sort of cultural fit to be aligned and to sort of mesh in. On the other hand, you want to be cautious of affinity bias and not be attracting people like yourself. And that's something I'm always very conscious of as a chair when we're looking at board members, because you do think, are these people going to fit and be able to contribute on our board, and therefore is there some sort of alignment there? But that the kind of little red flag of am I suffering from affinity bias here always waves at me, because what you're looking for are different perspectives and different points of view, and so getting that balance right is really important. I think that the critical thing when you're in the boardroom is to create an environment that everyone feels a sense of belonging, they feel a sense of attachment to the organization, and that they understand what is important to the organization. So when we talk about values and behaviors from an organizational perspective, we talk about that in the boardroom as well, in terms of our values and behaviors as board members, and are we exhibiting the same values and behaviors that we say are important for the organization? Because if we're not, there's a bit of a mismatch here, because back to that point about role modeling, I think boards have a really important duty to role model behaviors to the leadership team who are attending and then through the rest of the organization. But creating an environment that is inclusive so that everybody feels that they can make a point, that their point is going to be heard. It might not be agreed with, but it's going to be heard, and they can make that point, and we can have a robust discussion and conversation about it is really important.
How do you do that? One of the challenges I've encountered recently, which has been fascinating, is dealing with extreme introverts, where you feel like you're being inclusive, but actually it's not until much later when you really push and probe that you suddenly realize they weren't buying in. So what practically are you doing in those boardrooms to give yourself confidence that you are fostering that sense of inclusivity?
Yeah, well, I think I said before that I think sometimes a lot of the work should get done outside of the boardroom, and I think where you've got introverts on your board or in your senior leadership team, actually doing that in a smaller group or a subcommittee or something of that nature, where they feel more comfortable, they've got the opportunity to reflect and come back to you, or you create the line of communication between you and them as a kind of board member. That becomes really important, and I think it's understanding what is going to create the right environment for them to contribute, and sometimes it takes people a little bit of time before they feel that they can contribute fully to the board. We've had experience of one person who said nothing for about 3 board meetings, and I involved her in a subcommittee, and she's been absolutely brilliant on the subcommittee. You can see that she's now much more confident, contributes much more around the board table and the board discussions as well. I think part was around confidence and part was around personality. So it's about trying to create the environment for them to ensure that they can contribute. Because back to the point, everybody wants to contribute. Everybody feels that they have something to offer. Because otherwise they wouldn't be there.
And have you sort of faced examples where you realize, I mean, there's this balance between trying to foster the sense of inclusivity, and then sometimes you've got someone who's just disruptive. Have you had that opposite end of the spectrum, and how do you know when? How do you think about where that line is?
Yes, is the answer. And I think very often you'll have a conversation with the CEO about that sort of thing. And I think, we have to be clear about where the responsibilities rise. It's the responsibility of the chair to run the board. And therefore, if it's one of the non-execs who's not acting in the right way, then it's the chair who has to take the responsibility for having the conversation. And I'm happy to do that, and I'll do it in a way that is going to work for the execs on the board as well as the board member as well. Because I think if you're really going to drive performance, you've got to fundamentally change your relationship with feedback and be comfortable with that. And I think where you have a good relationship between board and execs, and you have a high trust, high degree of psychological safety, then those sorts of conversations are far easier to have, if you don't have that sense of trust.
Are there sort of particular exercises or initiatives that you've seen that have driven particularly high levels of psychological safety in the boards that you've been involved with?
Yeah, I think I would come back to the social side of things. I mean, I always like to reference the trust equation in this, which talks about trust being a function of credibility, in other words, subject matter expertise, plus reliability, in other words, dependability, you do what you say you're going to do, plus intimacy, which I think is knowing the person and having the courage and confidence to show a degree of vulnerability and humility. And the denominator on the equation is self-interest. So when ego starts getting in the way, then that undermines trust. And in my experience, particularly teams and boards who perhaps only meet once every 4 times a year, or 4 times a year, I should say, the intimacy piece gets neglected. And so I think the more you can spend time and invest time in the intimacy piece and getting to know each other, if it's the sort of dinner before the board meeting, or if it's the kind of the one-to-ones, coffees outside of the board meetings, that really helps build that intimacy and consequently that trust. And hopefully, you don't have egos or too many egos in the room. I think, I think that's obviously a danger at times, because senior people like non-exec roles do have egos. That they've had egos because that's driven them to their positions. So I think it's how you manage that, and I think that's very often one of the skills of the chair to make sure that the egos are parked on the hat stand when they come into the boardroom.
You talked about the disruptors with a wry smile, and obviously having sort of experienced a few of them. What have you learned from those experiences that would sort of help you in the future?
Well, I think it's far less about the what and more about the how. So, very often the disruptors will have something really valuable to say. And it's about helping them to say that in a way that doesn't piss people off or irritate people or cause people to roll their eyes and, gosh, there they are, they're off on one again. And so I think it's, you don't want to stop the disruptive thought or the really interesting nugget which these people may have to offer. But you want them to learn how to present that in a way which isn't going to cause that the fractiousness or the irritation in people. And as I say, I think the role of the chair is very much to take responsibility for creating the right environment so that doesn't happen, and helping and supporting them to do it in the right way.
Got it. And that brings me nicely onto a topic that I've talked to you in the past around asking good questions in the boardroom. I'd love to know, again, this is something I guess as a coach you become very good at. But what are your sort of top tips for asking good questions?
I think, hopefully as a coach, I talk a lot about asking clean questions, which really helps focus on the vocabulary that people are using. And it's an invitation for them to to really explain why they are using a certain word at a certain point in time and what they really mean by it. It's about choosing that word and repeating it back to them with an implied question mark. We didn't feel confident enough to run that campaign. Confident. It's an invitation to say, what do you really mean by the word confident in the context of that? And that can be really, really insightful when they start exploring that. But we're very fortunate in the boards that I've worked with. I've observed some people who are absolutely fabulous at being quite brutal in their questioning, but they do it in such a kind way that it's completely disarming. And it could have the feeling that someone is being hung out to dry and hung, drawn, and quartered. It's being done in such a gentle and kind way that that there's no pain at all in some respects. But the finesse of how they do that is so good, as well as the insight that they're honing in on. And I think that's back to the point. It's a lot of it's about the how as well as the what, and the way that people approach the questioning. But I think more often than not, the questions that prove to be the most insightful are the ones that you think you'd like to ask, but you don't. And they're typically daft laddie questions. And normally it's because you make the assumption that, well, the exec must know the answer to that. But until you ask the question and you see that actually in asking the question, people start stumbling or that they might have covered something up or whatever, those are the interesting ones to ask. And I think I always say there's never a daft question to ask. If you feel like asking a question, just ask it.
The way you talk about those clean questions, one of the risks that I sometimes see with clean questions is that you can end up going down a completely different path from the one that you wanted to explore. And when you have limited time in a boardroom discussion and you have limited questions, if you're going to try to make sure that everyone is balanced, how do you guard against that? Or is it simply a different type of question that there are sometimes, really pointy questions that you should be asking?
I think that's it, Ollie. I mean, I think there will be times when, you need to ask the pointed questions, the very direct, straightforward questions. And I think it depends on time. And I think again, that comes down to the skill of the chair in managing the discussion. To be really clear about how much time are they going to allocate to this particular subject versus the agenda that you've got to get through, and be clear about actually that might be a really interesting thing to explore a bit further, but can we take that offline? So I think the whole board meeting management piece is really important in that regard.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another thing you've talked about is when you have those difficult conversations that sometimes leads to clearly unhappy body language. You've got people rolling their eyes or crossing their arms. And I think you've sort of given advice in the past to say, confront it head on. Say what you're noticing. And for example, I notice you're looking a bit defensive about that. Is there a way, was it an issue with the way I asked the question, or is it the question itself that's a problem? And funny enough, I've tried that in situations, and sometimes I feel like the way I ask it always ends up sounding, very challenging again. But you've got this remarkable demeanor that people just warm to you. The way you ask those questions are always, they never feel threatening. What's going through your head? Do you have a sort of framework for doing that, or is that just innate to your character?
Well, it's very kind of you to say so, Ollie. I think I've had plenty of opportunity to practice it. And I think it's like all of those skills, I think the more you practice these things, the more intuitive it becomes and the more comfortable you become with it as well. And so, I was going to say, don't be put off if you haven't succeeded, if it hasn't worked, keep doing it, because I think it's so important. It gives you so many body language and all these things give you so much insight into what's going on, what's really going on inside. And if you can explore that for people, it's going to add a sort of richness to the conversation and richness to the understanding of how things are. Because, I might cross my arms like this because that's actually quite comfortable for me, And if you say, I notice you cross your arms, I said, yeah, no, it's just because I feel comfortable. And you can do it in a disarming way. Normally, you said that point about just noticing what's going on and bringing that to people's attention. It's a very non-judgmental way to approach it. I think when you make an assumption around, are you defensive now, David, because you cross your arms? That's quite confrontational. And actually, I'm crossing my arms because that's the way that I feel comfortable. Do you know what I mean? And as I say, I think the more you practice those things, the more you can make a really neutral statement or observation, which then allows people either to say, well, actually, I feel really uncomfortable with what you said there because it felt quite personal. So that defensiveness was related to a comment that you made rather than, actually, that's because I like crossing my arms and sitting back in my chair type thing.
And how do you think about when to address those sorts of issues in the boardroom versus outside the boardroom? Because obviously there's an opportunity, it's the praise in public, reprimand in private model. And sometimes it feels like it can wait until outside the boardroom. What's your framework for thinking about when you actually need to confront that in the board?
Yeah, I think it depends on the context. So what is the subject matter that you're discussing? How controversial is it? Is it going to be helpful to tease out an opposing view to make sure that view's heard? Because back to that point about inclusion, I think the last thing you want is for someone to go out of the boardroom thinking, God, I was really upset with that, or really hacked off with the fact that they didn't take my point of view on, because they're going to feel disenfranchised, disengaged, excluded, all that sort of stuff. So if they get the opportunity to speak and you can tease that out and have a conversation about it and be really clear about why you don't agree with that point of view, or that that point of view is valid, but in this instance we're doing X, Y, Z, then at least it's out in the open, and they might still feel hacked off, but at least they've had the opportunity to say it in an environment which is the environment to say those things. So I think context is always really, really important. And it's like everything else, Holly. There's no right or wrong. It's your judgment, and that is the joy of being the chair. You can choose to bring it to someone's attention or not, and hope that you're making the right judgment on the day.
David, I could keep asking you questions all day long, but it's time to move on to our final 5-question quickfire wrap-up. So I'll say a short statement and then ask you for a quick response.
Gosh, right, okay. Thank you.
So your best book that every board member should read, and why?
I'm a big fan of Jim Collins' Good to Great, and I think the first chapter is about level 5 leadership. The bit that always resonates for me is look into the mirror to apportion blame and look out of the window to apportion success, to celebrate success, rather than into the mirror to celebrate success and out of the window to apportion blame. I think that's having that humility and sharing the success with people rather than taking the credit yourself is really important.
I love that book, and I had forgotten that bit, so thank you so much. Your favourite quote and why?
It's along a similar line. It's an Indira Gandhi quote, and she said that there are 2 types of people in the world: those who do the work and those who take the credit. Try and be the first group, because there's a lot less competition there. And I think it's that you will be rewarded if you focus on getting the work done rather than actually trying to self-promote. So I think humility, you can see, is important to me.
I love that. Your best ever holiday and why?
Gosh, best ever holiday. I think the last big family holiday that we had, which was to New Zealand over Christmas, my youngest son was out there. So we thought, right, we'll take Christmas to him. And we had an amazing holiday. We had Christmas up in the Bay of Islands, up on the North Island. And then we went down to Queenstown for New Year, for Hogmanay. And we did hot air ballooning. We did whitewater rafting. We did jet boating. It was just brilliant. It was the last holiday with the whole family, and we're a very strong, close-knit family, and it was just fantastic.
Sounds amazing. Your most significant professional insight? Nice easy one.
Do you know, I worked with a mentor quite recently, and we were working around race and ethnicity, so a bit of reverse mentoring. And biggest insight around this was, I was saying, I'm not a racist. And we talked about my upbringing. And I know my father had some very strong views, and the language he used to describe cricketers from the West Indies or the Asian subcontinent, was racist. And she was brilliant in bringing that to my attention and said, you've got to accept that rather than deny it. And you can, in accepting it, you can then stand against it. Whereas if you deny it, you're shoveling it under the carpet somewhere. And it was just a really brilliant insight for me. And that sort of difference between acceptance and denial in this particular context, which is such a critical issue at the moment, was really profound for me. And she's a wonderful woman. I had lunch with her the other day, and we had a load of laughs and a great conversation. But, I think about her an awful lot in terms of, the society that we're living in at the moment and what she's taught me.
Brilliant. Nice, easy one to finish on. Your favorite app?
Gosh, it depends on what I'm interested in. I mean, from a functional perspective, I like WhatsApp because it's, very easy and simple. But I'm a bit of a sad man. We've got a small holding up here, and there's an app called sellmylivestock.com. And I've sort of go onto that to see if there are belted Galloways for sale or pigs for sale, weaner pigs or chickens and stuff like that. So, yeah, there's a bit of a weird one, that, Ollie. So.
I love that. I think that might be my favorite app to date. David, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you, as always, packed full of insights, and really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. It's great to see you again.